He was standing in the back corner of the funeral home when I noticed him, and something about the way he watched my father's casket made my chest tighten with a grief I didn't understand. I'd been greeting mourners for 3 hours, accepting condolences and casseroles from neighbors I barely knew, when I saw him. Tall, maybe 6'2", with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore a simple black suit that looked expensive but understated, and he held himself with this quiet dignity that made him stand out among the crowd of well-meaning strangers. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were fixed on my father's casket with an intensity that felt almost sacred, like he was having a conversation with someone who could no longer answer back. There was pain there, raw and deep, but also something else. Something that looked almost like love. Before I continue this, hit that subscribe button. I post one real story every single day. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'm always curious who my stories are reaching. My father had been the kind of man who kept his past close to his chest. Growing up in our small Virginia town, I'd known him as the quiet mechanic who could fix anything with wheels, the man who taught me to change oil and throw a curveball, who tucked me in every night until I was too old to admit I still wanted him to. But there had always been the sense that there were chapters of his life I didn't know about, stories he'd never shared. Now, watching this stranger grieve my father with such raw intensity, I wondered what those stories might have been. The service was beautiful in that devastating way that funerals can be. Pastor Williams spoke about my father's generosity, his quiet strength, the way he'd helped half the town with car troubles and never asked for payment. My Aunt Linda shared stories about their childhood, about the boy who'd rescued stray cats and taught himself to play guitar by listening to the radio. But through it all, I kept glancing back at the stranger in the corner. He never moved from his spot, never approached the casket, never spoke to anyone. He just stood there, perfectly still, like he was holding vigil. When the service ended and people began filing out to the cemetery, he was the last to leave. I watched him pause at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, and I could have sworn I saw his lips move in what might have been a prayer or a goodbye. The burial was a blur of flowers and tears and the sound of dirt hitting wood. By the time we returned to my childhood home for the reception, I was exhausted in that bone-deep way that grief brings. The house filled with neighbors bearing covered dishes and awkward condolences, everyone trying to fill the impossible silence my father had left behind. I was in the kitchen, mechanically putting casseroles in the refrigerator, when I heard the knock at the back door. It was soft, almost hesitant, and something about it made me pause with a tuna noodle casserole halfway to the shelf. I opened the door, and there he was. Up close, I could see that his eyes were a deep green, like the color of pine trees in shadow. There were lines around them that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure, and when he looked at me, I felt something shift in my chest. Recognition, maybe, though I was certain I'd never seen him before in my life. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, and his voice was exactly what I'd expected, deep and careful, with just a hint of a southern accent that had been softened by years away from home. "I'm James. James Mackenzie." I knew your father." "I'm Emma," I said, though he probably already knew that. "I saw you at the service. Thank you for coming." He nodded, his hands clasped behind his back like he wasn't sure what to do with them. I wondered if I might. Could I have a few minutes? To talk about him. I should have said no. The house was full of people, and I had hostess duties, and I didn't know this man from anyone. But something in his expression, something vulnerable and desperate, made me step aside and gesture him into the kitchen. "Coffee?" I asked, more out of habit than hospitality. "That would be nice." I busied myself with the coffee maker, grateful for something to do with my hands. "How did you know my dad?" James was quiet for so long that I turned around to see if he'd heard me. He was standing by the window, looking out at the small garden my father had tended with religious devotion, and there was something almost tender in his expression. "We grew up together," he said finally. "Different neighborhoods, but we went to the same high school. Played on the same baseball team." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "We were best friends. Brothers, really." "I've never heard him mention you." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and I saw something flicker across his face. "Pain, maybe." Or guilt? No, he said quietly. I don't suppose he would have. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence between us. I leaned against the counter, studying this man who claimed to have been my father's brother, trying to reconcile his presence with the fact that my father had never once spoken his name. We had a falling out, James said, as if he could read my thoughts. A long time ago. Before you were born. What kind of falling out? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. It wasn't just grief. It was regret, deep and old and painful. The kind that costs you everything that matters. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured 2 cups, adding sugar to mine and leaving his black. When I handed it to him, our fingers brushed, and I felt that same jolt of recognition I'd experienced at the door. Why are you here? I asked. If you two weren't speaking. Because I loved him. The words came out simple and direct, and there was something in the way he said them that made my chest tighten. Because I made a mistake 26 years ago that I've regretted every day since. Because I heard he was gone and I couldn't. I couldn't let him go without saying goodbye. I set down my coffee cup, my hands suddenly unsteady. What kind of mistake? James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee like it held answers he was afraid to find. I left, he said finally. When he needed me most, I left. And I've been trying to find the courage to come back ever since. Left for where? California. Got a job offer, thought I was going to conquer the world. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Thought I was too good for this small town, too big for the life we'd built here. And my father? Your father was getting married. To your mother. They'd just bought this house, and he was so happy, so excited about the future they were building together. James set down his cup and looked at me directly. He asked me to be his best man. Something cold settled in my stomach. But you left instead. I left instead. The simple admission hung between us, heavy with 26 years of regret. He tried to reach out, James continued. Called, wrote letters. But I was young and proud and stupid, and I thought I was proving something by cutting ties with everything that reminded me of the life I was trying to leave behind. Including him. Including him. He ran a hand over his face, and I could see the exhaustion there, the weight of carrying this guilt for so long. By the time I realized what I'd lost, what I'd thrown away, too much time had passed. I didn't know how to bridge that gap. I thought about my father, about the way he'd sometimes get this distant look when we'd drive past the baseball field where he'd played in high school. About the box of old photographs I'd found in his closet after he died, pictures of him and a dark-haired boy I didn't recognize, both of them grinning and covered in dirt, arms slung around each other's shoulders like nothing in the world could separate them. You're the boy in the photographs, I said suddenly. James looked surprised. What photographs? In his closet. There's a whole shoebox full of them. You and him, playing baseball, fishing, just being kids. I swallowed hard. He kept them all these years. Something crumbled in James's face, and for a moment I thought he might cry. He kept them. Every single one. We stood there in my father's kitchen, two strangers bound together by grief and the ghost of a friendship that had been lost to time and pride. Outside, I could hear the murmur of voices from the living room, the sound of people sharing memories of a man who had apparently kept his deepest friendship locked away in a shoebox. Why are you telling me this? I asked. James set down his coffee cup and looked at me with those green eyes that held too much sadness. Because I owe him that much. Because you deserve to know that your father was loved by more people than you realized. He paused. And because you look like him. When he was young. And talking to you feels like getting one last chance to tell him I'm sorry. What would you do if you were in my place? Tell me in the comments. I stared at this man who claimed to have been my father's best friend, this stranger who had shown up at the funeral like a ghost from a past I'd never known existed. Part of me wanted to ask him to leave, to take his guilt and his regrets and his too-late apologies and get out of my father's house. But a bigger part of me wanted to know more, wanted to hear the stories my father had never told, wanted to understand the friendship that had shaped him in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. Tell me about him, I said finally. Tell me about the person he was before I knew him. Relief flooded James's face, and he pulled out one of the kitchen chairs, settling into it like he'd been waiting his entire life for permission to remember. He was fearless, he said, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was warmth in his voice. Absolutely fearless. He'd climb any tree, jump off any bridge, stand up to any bully. I was the cautious one, always thinking through the consequences, but Danny, your father, he just lived. Danny? That's what I called him. Daniel was too formal for someone who spent half his time covered in motor oil and the other half rescuing stray animals. I smiled despite myself. That sounded like my father. He taught me to drive, James continued. Not my parents, not some driving instructor, Danny. In his dad's old Chevy pickup, out on the back roads where we couldn't hurt anything but our pride. I must have stalled that truck 100 times, but he never lost patience. Just kept saying, "Try again, Jimmy. You'll get it." Jimmy? What he called me. James smiled, and it transformed his entire face, made him look younger, less burdened. Nobody else, just him. For the next hour, James told me stories I'd never heard. About my father's terrible singing voice and his inexplicable fear of butterflies. About the time they'd tried to build a treehouse and ended up with something that looked more like abstract art. About the night they'd stayed up until dawn talking about their dreams, about the lives they wanted to build, about the promise they'd made to be best men at each other's weddings and godfathers to each other's children. He would have been a wonderful godfather, James said quietly. He would have spoiled your kids rotten and taught them to throw curveballs and told them embarrassing stories about their mother. I don't have kids. Yet? The word hung between us, full of possibility and assumption, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. What about you? I asked, more to change the subject than out of genuine curiosity. Did you ever get married? Have kids? Something shuddered in his expression. I tried. A few times. But I could never. He stopped, shook his head. I kept comparing everyone to what I'd left behind. To the kind of friendship, the kind of love that I'd had here. Nothing ever measured up. That's a lonely way to live. Yes, he said simply. It is. The afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor my father had installed himself 10 years ago. In the living room, I could hear the sounds of the reception winding down, chairs scraping, dishes clattering, voices growing fainter as people began to leave. I should go, James said, standing up from the table. You have guests, and I've taken up enough of your time. Wait. The word came out before I could stop it, and he paused with his hand on the back door handle. Where are you staying? The motel on Route 9. For how long? He was quiet for a moment, and when he looked at me, there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. I don't know. I took a leave of absence from work, drove here without really thinking about what came next. He ran a hand through his hair. I suppose I should head back to California soon. There's nothing for me here anymore. There's me. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and we both froze. James stared at me, his green eyes wide with surprise, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. I stammered, if you want to tell me more stories. About him. About what he was like. Emma, I know it's crazy. I know you're a stranger, and I know this whole situation is completely insane. But I took a shaky breath. I just lost the most important person in my world, and you're telling me there were parts of him I never knew. Parts of him that only you remember. James took a step closer, and I could smell his cologne, something clean and woody that reminded me of the forest behind our house. You don't know me, he said gently. No, I don't. But you knew him. And right now, that feels like enough. We looked at each other across my father's kitchen, and I felt something shift between us. Something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way my pulse quickened when he stepped closer. This is complicated, he said quietly. Most things worth doing are. He smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made something warm unfurl in my chest. Your father used to say that. I know. He said it to me too. James reached out slowly, carefully, and touched my hand where it rested on the kitchen counter. His fingers were warm and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with his tools, who built things that lasted. I'd like that, he said. I'd like to tell you more stories about him. Good. But Emma, I need you to understand something. What? I'm not staying just for him anymore. I'm not staying just to make amends with a ghost. His thumb brushed across my knuckles, and I felt that touch all the way down to my toes. I'm staying because when I look at you, I see something I thought I'd lost the right to hope for a long time ago. My breath caught in my throat. James, I know this is fast. I know the timing is terrible. I know I'm 20 years older than you and carrying more baggage than anyone should have to deal with. His eyes searched mine, looking for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. But I also know that life is short and uncertain, and sometimes the most important things happen when you least expect them. Before I could respond, before I could think too hard about what I was doing, I stepped closer and reached up to touch his face. His skin was warm beneath my palm, and when he leaned into my touch, I felt something click into place, something that felt like coming home. "Stay," I whispered. "Please. Just stay." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked like hope. "Okay," he said. "I'll stay." 3 months later, James extended his leave of absence indefinitely. 6 months after that, he sold his house in California and bought the little cottage on Maple Street, 3 blocks from where I still lived in my father's house. We take things slow, James and I. We have coffee in my kitchen every morning, and he tells me stories about my father while I get ready for work. On weekends, we work in the garden my father started, planting new flowers and pulling weeds and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes I catch him looking at the old photographs I framed and hung in the hallway, the ones of him and my father as boys, and I see the peace that's slowly replacing the regret in his eyes. People in town talk, of course. About the age difference, about the strangeness of how we met, about whether it's appropriate for me to be dating my father's old friend. But James teaches me not to care about their whispers, the same way my father taught him not to care about anything except what matters. And what matters is this: he knew my father when my father was young and wild and full of dreams. He loved him then, and he loves him still, and now he loves me too, in a way that feels like it was always supposed to happen, like my father somehow knew we'd find each other in the end. Before I go, thank you. These stories are real. They're mine. And I share one every day. If you want to hear more, subscribe. Sometimes I think my father orchestrated the whole thing from wherever he is now, that he somehow arranged for James to show up at exactly the moment I needed him most. James laughs when I tell him this theory, but I catch him looking up at the sky sometimes with this expression that suggests he thinks I might be right.